Good morning, everyone. It's
Good
Robert
morning.
and Gina, Route 87 Liquors. Hope you had an amazing Super Bowl weekend. Hope your team won, whoever that may be. We are here today to let you know that we have Valentine's Day little gifts for you to that last minute. You already know how we are, that if you forget us, you're in trouble.
July 2025, San Antonio Police Department officers were dispatched to a residential property in the 2400 block of Christian Drive on the southeast side of San Antonio, Texas, after family members reported concern when 62-year-old Gina Craig Byrd and her husband, 64-year-old Robert Charles Byrd, failed to open their business and could not be reached. Upon entry during a welfare check, officers located both individuals deceased from gunshot wounds inside the home. The Bexar County Medical Examiner's office later ruled Gina's death a homicide and Robert's death a suicide, leading investigators to treat the incident as a suspected murder-suicide. The San Antonio Police Department continues to investigate the circumstances that led to these deaths, seeking to establish a full timeline, potential motives, and contributing factors in the events preceding the discovery. Stay with us as we unravel this shocking story and uncover the heartbreaking details of what led to this senseless loss. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what are your thoughts as the story unfolds? Welcome to True Crime Tales, where we reveal the crimes that shock communities and the secrets hidden behind closed doors. These are real people, real events, real consequences. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's begin. Gina Craig Byrd was a 62-year-old resident of San Antonio, Texas. She lived with her husband in a residential neighborhood on the southeast side of the city. Gina was known to be involved in a locally operated business that she and her husband managed together. Her daily routine was structured around maintaining the household and overseeing business responsibilities, which included opening the business during regular operating hours and handling customer-facing duties. Within her family structure, Gina was married to Robert Charles Byrd. The couple appear to function as a unit, both personally and professionally. There is no public record indicating that Gina had minor children living in the home at the time of her death. Extended family members remained in contact with her and were familiar with her routine, which later became relevant when concerns arose. Gina's role in the community centered primarily on business ownership. She and her husband were known locally through their business, which made their absence noticeable when operations unexpectedly stopped. There were no public reports of criminal history, restraining orders, or prior law enforcement involvement associated with Gina. Details of Gina's personal history, including her childhood, early career, and broader social ties, have not been extensively released to the public. Investigators typically review such background information to identify patterns, stressors, or changes in behavior. This includes employment history, long-term friendships, family relationships, and any recent life changes that may have affected daily routines. Robert Charles Byrd was 64 years old and resided in the same San Antonio home as his wife, Gina. He was also involved in the operation of the couple's business. His responsibilities reportedly included behind-the-scenes operations, logistical management, and shared decision-making related to finances and scheduling. Robert's relationship history indicates a long-term marriage to Gina Craig Byrd. There is no publicly documented evidence of prior marriages or separations. The couple's partnership extended beyond their personal relationship into their professional life, where they worked together daily.
Welcome to Route. It's Gina and Robert. Y'all know what time it is. It's the Father's Day drawing, as we promised, coming at you. For the boys, for Father's Day, we had the boys for the boys. We had Jack, Jim, Evan, Paul, Tito, John, Jose, and John. And so now here we are for the drawing. We have 3 lucky winners to win one of 3 gifts. So we're going to get started here. My lovely husband here, who I'm also honoring for Father's Day.
As a business co-owner, Robert was responsible for aspects of the operation that required consistency and reliability. The failure to open the business on the day authorities were alerted raised immediate concern among those familiar with his habits. Missed obligations were considered unusual based on prior patterns. Regarding personal challenges, investigators generally examined potential financial stress, medical conditions, or psychological factors when assessing cases classified as murder-suicide. While specific diagnoses or conditions have not been publicly disclosed, standard investigative procedures include reviewing medical records, prescription history, financial documents, and recent behavioral changes. These factors are evaluated to determine whether any underlying issues may have contributed to the sequence of events. Robert maintained social connections primarily through business interactions and community presence. There were no widely reported disputes, public disturbances, or documented conflicts involving him prior to the incident. Gina and Robert Byrd shared a long-term marital relationship marked by joint business ownership and shared residence. Their partnership appeared stable from an external perspective, with no public records indicating separation proceedings, restraining orders, or domestic disturbance calls to law enforcement. The timeline of their marriage has not been publicly detailed, but their established routines and shared responsibilities suggest a long-standing partnership. They were regularly seen together at their place of business and were known in their community as a married couple working side by side. Publicly observed interactions reflected a consistent pattern of cooperation and routine. Neighbors and associates later reported no obvious signs of conflict visible from outside the household. Anecdotal accounts typically reference predictable schedules and quiet behavior. Extended family members maintain enough contact to recognize deviations from normal behavior, particularly the failure to open the business and lack of communication. These observations became critical in prompting a welfare check. In the days leading up to the discovery, the Byrds were last known to be at their residence. The final confirmed communications with family members occurred prior to the day the business failed to open. Phone calls and messages sent afterward went unanswered. No emergency calls originating from the residence were reported prior to police involvement. There are also no confirmed reports of disturbances, gunshots, or unusual activity noted by neighbors during the immediate time frame. The business operated by the Byrds did not open as scheduled on the day of concern. This deviation from routine was considered significant by family members familiar with their consistent attendance and reliability. As attempts to reach both Gina and Robert failed, concern escalated. Family members attempted multiple forms of contact before deciding to request a welfare check. The decision was based on a combination of missed business operations, lack of communication, and absence of any explanation for disruption. The welfare check request was placed to 911, prompting dispatch of San Antonio Police Department officers to the residence. Officers arrived at the home during daylight hours and attempted to make contact through standard procedures, including knocking and announcing their presence. When no response was received, officers gained entry into the residence. The method of entry was consistent with welfare check protocols, which may include forced entry when there is reasonable concern for occupant safety. Inside the home, officers located both Gina Craig Byrd and Robert Charles Byrd. Each was found with apparent gunshot wounds. The scene was immediately secured, and homicide investigators were notified. The initial assessment indicated that Gina's injuries were inconsistent with self-inflicted wounds, while Robert's injuries were consistent with suicide. Officers confirmed the identities of both individuals and notified next of kin. SAPD spokespersons later confirmed the deaths during press briefings, stating that the investigation was ongoing and that the incident was being treated as a suspected murder-suicide pending further examination. Autopsies were conducted by the Bexar County Medical Examiner's office. Gina Craig Byrd's autopsy determined that she died from gunshot wounds and classified her manner of death as homicide. The findings indicated that the injuries were inflicted by another individual. Robert Charles Byrd's autopsy determined that his death resulted from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His manner of death was classified as suicide. Ballistics examinations were conducted to analyze the firearm involved, bullet trajectories, and wound characteristics. These findings supported the determination that the same firearm was used in both deaths. The positioning of the bodies within the residence was documented and analyzed to establish sequence and movement within the home. Bloodstain patterns and scene layout were consistent with the conclusions reached by investigators. Estimated times of death were determined based on forensic indicators, including body condition and scene context. Toxicology reports were also conducted to assess the presence of substances that could have influenced behavior. Results were reviewed as part of the overall case assessment. On the morning of July 7th, 2025, officers with the San Antonio Police Department were dispatched to a residence on the southeast side of San Antonio, Texas, following a welfare check request placed by family members. The request was made after repeated attempts to contact Gina Craig Byrd, age 62, and her husband, Robert Charles Byrd, age 64, were unsuccessful. Additional concern arose when the couple failed to open their business as scheduled, an unusual occurrence according to relatives. Officers arrived at the residence during daylight hours after the welfare check request was processed through emergency dispatch. The exact arrival time was documented in police call logs and became a key reference point for investigators attempting to establish the latest possible window in which the deaths may have occurred. Patrol officers were the first to arrive, followed by supervisory personnel, once the situation escalated beyond a routine welfare check. Upon arrival, officers attempted to make contact by knocking and announcing their presence. After receiving no response and observing indicators that raised concern, officers made a forced entry into the residence in accordance with welfare check procedures. The entry was conducted carefully to preserve the interior condition of the home, as the lack of response suggested a possible medical emergency or other serious situation inside. Once inside, officers located Gina Craig Byrd and Robert Charles Byrd in separate areas of the home. Gina Byrd was found inside one of the interior rooms of the residence, while Robert Byrd was discovered in a different location within the house. The positioning of the bodies, as well as their distance from one another, was immediately documented and photographed. Investigators later noted that the locations were consistent with a sequence of events occurring inside the home rather than an intrusion from outside. Responding officers observed visible gunshot wounds on both individuals. There were no signs of forced entry from outside the home beyond the police entry itself. The interior of the residence did not show signs of a struggle involving multiple individuals. Furniture placement, household items, and door locks appeared undisturbed. Officers also noted the presence of at least one firearm inside the residence, which was later secured for examination. After confirming that both individuals were deceased, officers immediately secured the residence as a crime scene. Access was restricted, and a perimeter was established to prevent contamination of potential evidence. Detectives, crime scene technicians, and supervisory personnel were notified and dispatched to the location. The medical examiner's office was also contacted to arrange for body examinations and removal. Based on visible injuries and the presence of firearm, officers conducted a preliminary assessment indicating gunshot wounds as the cause of death for both individuals. At this stage, the manner of death had not yet been officially determined. The scene was treated as a potential homicide investigation until further forensic analysis could clarify the sequence of events. Following the removal of the bodies from the residence, full autopsies were conducted by the Bexar County Medical Examiner's office. These examinations were essential in determining the precise causes and manners of death, as well as confirming or disproving initial assumptions made at the scene. The autopsy revealed that Gina Craig Byrd died as a result of gunshot wound injuries. The examination documented the number of wounds, their locations, and the trajectory of projectile or projectiles involved. No defensive injuries were reported on her hands or arms, and there were no indications of prolonged physical struggle prior to death. Based on forensic findings, the medical examiner classified Gina Byrd's death as a homicide. This classification reflected that her fatal injury was inflicted by another person and was not self-inflicted. This determination was a critical factor in shaping the direction of the investigation. The autopsy of Robert Charles Byrd also confirmed death by gunshot wound. The injury pattern, wound location, and trajectory were consistent with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The medical examiner found no injuries indicating involvement by another person at the time of his death. Ballistics analysis linked the recovered firearm to the gunshot wounds sustained by both individuals. Shell casings and ballistic evidence collected from the scene were consistent with the firearm recovered inside the residence. No evidence of additional weapons being discharged was found. Using a combination of livor mortis, rigor mortis, and environmental factors inside the home, the medical examiner estimated that both deaths occurred within a similar time frame prior to police arrival. This estimate helped investigators narrow the timeline and rule out prolonged gaps between the two deaths. Toxicology testing was conducted on both individuals to determine the presence of alcohol, prescription medication, or illicit substances. The results were reviewed by investigators to assess whether impairment or substance use may have influenced the events leading up to the deaths. No findings were publicly released that altered the overall conclusions of the case. With the medical examiner's findings completed, investigators focused on reconstructing the events leading up to the deaths through evidence collection, forensic analysis, and interviews. Crime scene technicians collected physical evidence from throughout the residence, including the firearm, ammunition, spent shell casings, and personal items. Documentation included photographs, measurements, and scene diagrams to preserve an accurate record of the home's interior. The firearm recovered at the scene was processed for fingerprints, DNA, and mechanical function testing. Investigators confirmed ownership and access, determining that the weapon was legally possessed and readily available inside the home. Blood spatter analysis was used to support the sequence of events indicated by body placement and ballistic trajectories. The patterning supported the conclusion that the shootings occurred inside the home without movement of the bodies afterward. Investigators examined mobile phones, call logs, text messages, and other digital data belonging to both individuals. The review focused on communications in the days leading up to the incident, including any messages that might indicate planning, distress, or external involvement. Financial records and business documents were reviewed to determine whether financial strain, disputes, or operational issues existed. Bank statements, transaction histories, and business obligations were examined as part of the broader context assessment. Family members were interviewed to establish recent interactions, behavioral changes, and any concerns that may have arisen before contact was lost. These interviews also helped establish the timeline that led to the welfare check request. Neighbors and business associates were contacted to determine whether unusual activity, sounds, or behavior had been observed. No evidence emerged suggesting the involvement of an outside party. By the time investigators reached the scene, the case had already taken shape as a possible murder-suicide. The San Antonio Police Department had to treat the discovery as a potential homicide, while also considering whether the deaths could be linked to a single individual acting against their spouse. Determining whether this was a murder-suicide required investigators to analyze the physical evidence, forensic results, witness statements, and any digital footprints that could establish a clear timeline. The classification would not be made based on assumption, but on evidence that could support either scenario. The initial factor that led investigators toward a murder-suicide determination was the placement and condition of both victims within the residence. The scene did not show evidence of forced entry, and there were no signs that an unknown party had been inside the home. Both victims were found in a location that suggested the events occurred within the private space of the home, rather than as part of a public confrontation. Investigators also noted that the only known individuals present in the home were the couple themselves, and no external witness accounts suggested a third party had been seen entering or exiting. Another factor was a forensic analysis of the firearm. Ballistics and fingerprint analysis are standard procedures in cases involving gunshot deaths. Investigators would look for fingerprints on the weapon, gunshot residue on the hands of either victim, and the trajectory of the bullets. If the evidence showed that the weapon was handled in a way consistent with one person firing at another and then turning the weapon on themselves, it would support the murder-suicide conclusion. In addition, the absence of other weapons or signs of a struggle contributed to this classification. The Bexar County Medical Examiner's office classified Gina Craig Byrd's death as a homicide. This classification indicates that her death was caused by the actions of another person. For homicide classification, the medical examiner must determine that the injury was inflicted by someone other than the victim. The classification typically reflects the manner of death based on the physical evidence and autopsy results. In the case of Gina Byrd, the evidence supporting homicide classification would include the nature and location of her gunshot wound or wounds, the presence of defensive injuries, and the trajectory of the bullet. The autopsy would document the number of shots, entry and exit wounds, and any related physical trauma. These findings will be compared with the physical evidence found at the scene to establish whether the injuries were consistent with another person firing the weapon at her. The classification also reflects that the medical examiner found no evidence that the injury was self-inflicted. If the injury is inconsistent with the victim being able to shoot themselves in the manner observed, the death is ruled a homicide. This determination is based strictly on the forensic findings, including the angle of entry and the location of the wound. The medical examiner classified Robert Charles Byrd's death as a suicide. This classification indicates that the injuries were self-inflicted and that the medical examiner found evidence consistent with the victim having caused his own death. In cases involving firearms, suicide classification often depends on the angle of the gunshot, the presence of residue on the hands, and the absence of evidence indicating another person was involved. In this case, evidence supporting suicide classification would include gunshot residue testing on Robert Byrd's hands, the trajectory and angle of the wound consistent with self-infliction, and the location of the firearm in relation to his body. Investigators would also evaluate whether there were any defensive wounds or signs of struggle. The absence of these signs, combined with the position of the weapon, can support a suicide determination. The presence of a single firearm, located in a position consistent with self-use, strengthens the suicide conclusion. The medical examiner's findings would also include a review of toxicology results and medical history that could indicate whether Robert Byrd was capable of understanding the consequences of his actions. One of the key elements investigators had to address was whether any third party was involved. The scene showed no evidence of forced entry, no unidentified fingerprints, and no witnesses who reported seeing an unknown person near the home. Investigators would have also checked for surveillance footage from nearby businesses or residences to determine if anyone else approached the property during the relevant time frame. Investigators also looked for any signs of struggle or disturbances that would indicate an intruder. In the absence of such evidence, the case was treated as an internal event within the household. The absence of third-party involvement does not mean the conclusion is automatic. However, it does narrow the investigative direction and focuses the case on the actions of the couple themselves. Law enforcement statements indicated that the case was being treated as a suspected murder-suicide. Authorities confirmed the identities of both victims and reported that the medical examiner had ruled the deaths accordingly. Police also stated that they were continuing their investigation to verify the circumstances and determine whether any additional factors contributed to the event. The official position remained that the case was not being treated as a homicide involving an unknown suspect. The discovery of the couple's deaths generated an immediate reaction from relatives and the local community. Family members were notified by law enforcement and were asked to provide statements regarding the couple's recent behavior, health, and possible stressors. The sudden nature of the discovery required investigators to quickly gather information from those closest to the victims to reconstruct the final days and identify any warning signs. The couple's business operations were affected immediately. The business did not open, and the closure raised concerns among customers and neighbors. The property became the focus of police activity, which affected the surrounding neighborhood. Police vehicles and investigators remained on the scene while the investigation continued, limiting access to the property and drawing attention from nearby residents. Neighbors described increased police presence in the area, including officers conducting searches and securing the perimeter. The presence of law enforcement in a residential neighborhood can alter daily routines and create a heightened sense of scrutiny, which can lead to increased community awareness of the case. Those close to the couple had to confront the reality of the situation while investigators worked to confirm the facts. Family members were asked to provide documentation, including phone records, financial records, and any communication that might explain the events. Investigators also relied on these records to determine whether the deaths were planned or the result of a sudden escalation. Despite the medical examiner's classifications, several unanswered questions remained. Investigators sought to establish what occurred in the hours before the deaths. The timeline between the last known contact with the couple and the discovery of the bodies was a key area of focus. Investigators examined digital records, including phone calls and messages, to determine whether there was evidence of planning or conflict. Another question was whether warning signs were missed. Investigators reviewed reports from family members, friends, and neighbors to identify any recent changes in behavior or indications of stress. The investigation also examined whether any prior law enforcement interactions had occurred involving the couple. Motive possibilities were explored, including financial issues, personal conflict, or health-related stressors. Investigators reviewed financial records and business activity to determine whether there were signs of strain. They also examined any recent disputes or complaints that might have involved the couple. Gaps in the publicly available timeline remained a challenge. Authorities had not released full details of the evidence or the complete investigative findings. As a result, the public had access only to limited information, and many aspects of the case remained under review. The final classification by authorities remained as a homicide for Gina Byrd and a suicide for Robert Byrd. Investigators stated that the case was being treated as a suspected murder-suicide, with no evidence of a third-party suspect. The investigation status remained focused on verifying the timeline and confirming the evidence. Whether the case remained open or closed depended on whether additional evidence or leads emerged. Investigators would continue to review the case until all questions were resolved or until it was determined that no further information could be obtained. Handling of the couple's estate and business became a matter for surviving family members and legal representatives. Business closure and property matters would be addressed through standard legal processes. The long-term effects on surviving family members included dealing with the loss and the administrative responsibilities that followed. The case also became part of broader patterns in domestic homicide investigations, where evidence and classification are based on physical findings, forensic results, and the absence of third-party involvement. If you found this story as gripping and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. And if you want to hear more true crime stories that uncover the mysteries behind these tragic events, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss our latest stories, updates, and discussions. Thank you for joining us on this journey to seek justice and explore the truth. Together, we can make a difference. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.